Well, we're back for the Daily Word. We're in Acts 23 this morning. So if you got your Bible, why don't you turn there with me? And we're just going to look at the first 10 verses together. Kind of just want to quickly walk through the story with you and draw out a few points. So again, Paul is back in trouble. Yesterday we saw that he defended himself against a murderous rabble of Jews. Today he's in front of the Sanhedrin. He's on trial making another defense. And so we look down at verse 1, and we see Paul looks at this council, he looks at the Sanhedrin, and he says, "Brethren." Just as before, Paul is gracious, he's gentle, he's respectful, and he identifies himself with them. I mean, after all, he is a Jew. He probably used to be a Pharisee, and he's speaking to Pharisees and Sadducees, which constituted the Sanhedrin. And so he says, "Brethren." Basically like, hey, I identify with you as one of you. I'm not your enemy. And then he says, I've lived with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day in my life. Doesn't seem terribly inflammatory to say that. And yet, if you look at verse 2, the high priest Ananias commands one of the guards standing nearby to strike him on the mouth. Basically to punch him in the face for that. And immediately we see this contrast between the righteous and the wicked. Paul, the righteous one who was gracious and gentle and respectful. And then you have Ananias. He was the high priest. He should have been the most gracious, the most law-abiding, the most righteous man and upright one in the room. But he was actually one of the most corrupt high priests in Israel's history. Ananias was known for even having stolen tithes from other priests. And incidentally, when when Rome invaded and captured Jerusalem, Ananias fled. He hid in an aqueduct, and the Jewish guerrillas found him and executed him. He was not, needless to say, he was not a well-beloved man. And he was a vile man. That's why he said, strike him on the mouth. And it just highlights really the distinction between God's people and the world. As Christians, we have a standard. We live by the law of God. We live by His righteous rules. And so that governs our conduct, and yet the world doesn't have them. Ananias didn't really have them. And that's why Paul responds in verse 3. He says, God's going to strike you, you whitewashed wall, which is to say, you're a hypocrite. You're supposed to be upholding the law as a high priest. God had instituted you to keep the law, to be impartial, to be fair, and yet you're violating the law as you preside over the law? You're a hypocrite. And he was right. Ananias was a hypocrite. And so are so many lost people today. In fact, I just had a conversation with a girl at the gym recently who said, your truth is your truth, and you can do whatever you want as long as it doesn't conflict with my truth. And when I began to talk about the gospel, which conflicted with her truth, she got angry with me. She started butting in and just sort of talking over me. And then I said, listen, it's kind of hard to have a conversation if we can't finish our sentences. And she said, yeah, well, you said something I don't like. And it was just this blatant hypocrisy of, you can speak as long as you say something I like, but when you stop, then I get to dominate you, and I get to shut you out. And so Ananias displays that same sort of sinful hypocrisy by responding with violent anger against Paul. Of course, Paul didn't actually know that it was Ananias. He says that in verse 5 he recognizes, I was wrong. You're not supposed to speak ill of a ruler of the people. And it's very likely that Paul didn't know that it was Ananias. I mean, this wasn't a formal assembly of the Sanhedrin, so most likely Ananias was not wearing his high priestly robes. Paul had been gone for years, about a decade, so he wouldn't have recognized him, much less he wouldn't have recognized him without the high priestly robes. So yeah, Paul very likely just didn't know who it was. And he recognizes, I was wrong to speak that way. Even though Ananias was a worthless man, the office he occupied was significant. Now he continues in verse 6, and Paul realizes, hey, I'm not going to get a fair trial. Ananias is out to get me. He hates me. This thing could end in bloodshed, my blood being shed, if something doesn't change. So Paul is very clever. He recognizes that the crowd is composed of Pharisees and Sadducees. Pharisees believe in the resurrection of the dead. Sadducees don't. And this theological point was very contentious among them, as you will see. So Paul says, listen, I'm a Pharisee. I'm on trial for my belief in the resurrection. And he was being honest. He wasn't lying. He preached a resurrected Christ. And so he was on trial for the resurrection, for a belief in the fact that Jesus had been resurrected. Well, with those words, the room erupted. A massive debate ignited and ensued. And the Pharisees and the Sadducees started going back and forth. And the Pharisees, interestingly enough, sided with Paul and said, well, maybe he did have some sort of angelic visitor. And the Sadducees said, no, this is ridiculous. Because remember, they didn't buy into the resurrection. And so the Pharisees and Sadducees start going back and forth. It gets supremely heated, so heated, in fact, that the commander, Claudius, the Roman commander, he's watching this and he says, listen, Paul's going to be murdered in front of my eyes if I don't get down there. Which would have been bad news for him, because if a Roman soldier lost his prisoner, it was his life he just forfeited, his own life. And so the commander was not about to lose his life to a bunch of squabbling Jewish leaders. So he says, soldiers, go down there and rescue Paul. We're going to take him out. And they do. And God rescues Paul by means of the Roman commander. And it's just interesting how the Lord uses secondary causes, even pagans, to rescue his messenger. Paul was God's man. And God used Claudius, the pagan Roman commander, military commander, to rescue Paul. And so in this scene, we have a lot of interesting details, and it just again highlights the incredible contrast between believers and unbelievers, between truth and error, and between the hostility of the world and the truthfulness and the righteousness of the gospel. And they will always be in conflict, and they're still in conflict today, and that conflict will only be resolved in the end when Christ comes back to rescue his people and vanquish his enemies. So, we will see you tomorrow morning.